Podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
On this Locked On Big Ten podcast over the past couple of weeks, when we have looked ahead to the 2021 college football season, specifically within the Big Ten Conference, has been team focused, whether it was the spring football tour or setting Big Ten team win totals for the 2021 season. Today, our focus shifts from teams to players and some of the names you need to know for this upcoming year within the great Big Ten Conference. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Big Ten podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ben Stevens. It is Wednesday, May 19th, and on today's episode, like I mentioned, the focus is player-centric. We look around the Big Ten Conference, some of the stars and the highlight people you need to know as we look forward to the 2021 college football season. And helping us to do that, really the brainchild behind this entire operation, it is the managing editor of Saturday Tradition, Dustin Schutte, back on the podcast, our great friend of this program, here to detail some of those players that will become most likely household names in the 2021 Big Ten football season, if Dustin, they are not already. But first off, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Ben. It's always a lot of fun. And, we're getting to the end of spring football season with Rutgers closing up, and kickoff's going to be here before you know it. So this is the height of prediction and projection season. So I'm excited.
When does off-season become preseason for Dustin Schutte and the good folks over at Saturday Tradition?
Oh, man. I start looking ahead to the preseason. As soon as spring football is over, I start diving into the preseason talk. That's mine. Usually about media days is when the website kind of takes that focus, but I'm always looking ahead to next season.
And you are a very smart man, and grateful that you are able to do so, because really, sometimes, folks, when you get into the doldrums of May, you need to trust on other smart people. And we are reacting to a couple of articles that Dustin has written for Saturday Tradition, and he's the managing editor of such, so you need to go read his talented work about what we can expect in terms of those players that will highlight the Big Ten Conference in the 2020 college football season. And Dustin is not only a staple of this podcast here on Locked On Big Ten, whether it's been football or basketball in appearances past, but also the Locked On Podcast Network, a friend of multiple programs, as he was on Locked On Buckeyes with our good friend Jay Stevens just this past week as well. So, Dustin, you are very ingrained in the Locked On Podcast Network now. It is a pleasure to have you across multiple shows. This is going to be the real way that you are an essence of this Big Ten community.
Yeah, my goal is to get on every single one of these Big Locked On podcasts, because it's a lot of fun. Everybody in that network does a great job, and that includes yourself. You do great work. So it's always a lot of fun to have these, 25, 30-minute conversations, or however long they are, and talk Big Ten. I mean, I can never get enough of it. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking player-specific, the broad scope of the conference, or each individual team or a certain player. It's always so much fun, and hopefully people learn stuff, and I always walk away learning something as well.
I learn things when I read your articles at all times. And one of the ones that I thought was great this past week was some of the more than likely Big Ten people that might be Heisman favorites as we get into the 2021 college football season. If not favorites, at least possibly capable of contending for that award. And I thought it was a great breakdown for the Big Ten Conference that has not won a Heisman Trophy since 2006 in Ohio State quarterback Troy Smith. So now going on 14 plus years as we look ahead to the 2021 college football season. Out of the list that you assembled, Dustin, for that article on Saturday Tradition, what was one of the names that you think is most likely to be out of the Big Ten crop that can contend for the Heisman?
Well, I don't know if this is going to be a popular pick, but I have to go with the quarterback on the best team. I think people would probably label that the easy option, but I look at C.J. Stroud and I saw, him have his one carry for 48 yards in a big win over Michigan State last season. I saw the way he was throwing the ball all over the field in the spring game, back in April for Ohio State. And a lot of people will make a big deal about him not throwing a college pass yet, and I think that is certainly a significant thing to keep an eye on. But at the same time, let's go back to 2018. Dwayne Haskins, first-time starter, working under Ryan Day. He's a Heisman Trophy finalist. Justin, first-time starter at Ohio State, transferred in from Georgia, working under Ryan Day, Heisman finalist. He wasn't a Heisman finalist last season because of the hiccups he had against Northwestern and Indiana. And also, let's just be real, because the Big Ten had that limited schedule, so he didn't get those extra play. And then they had a few cancellations along the way. He could have certainly helped his draft stock with his Heisman stock with a few other games on that list. But I think Ryan Day is probably the best quarterback coach right now outside of maybe Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma. So I think C.J. Stroud is the guy. He's got an immense amount of weapons when you talk about Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Julian Fleming, Jackson Smith, and Jigba.
Yeah.
And Marvin Harrison Jr. looked really good in that spring game as well. So I think when you look at what C.J. Stroud did in his limited action last season, what you saw from the spring game, and then couple that with the fact that you have Ryan Day coaching him, and he's got a plethora of wide receivers and a really good offensive line coming back, I think he has a great opportunity to be in that Heisman conversation. And that would be quite an accomplishment for, as we said, a guy who hasn't thrown a pass in a college football game yet.
Right. Just a redshirt freshman, doesn't have a ton of experience in college football, as we know, but more than likely to be the starter for Ohio State as we get ready for this fall campaign in 2021. And you bring up an excellent point, because the Ohio State Buckeyes will continuously have their sights set on making the college football playoff. If that is the case, the quarterback of said team that gets to the CFP will obviously be in the national spotlight. I also think you bring up an important point about focusing on that quarterback position, because the signal caller in 17 of the past 21 Heisman trophies has won a Heisman Trophy. Since the year 1999, when Ron Dane of Wisconsin won it as a running back, 17 of the 21 Heisman trophies that have been given out have gone to a quarterback. Of course, last year was Devontae Smith, a wide receiver. The other three in that mark have been to running backs. A wide receiver is really not in the running for it on most years unless they are spectacular and can be a part of the return game as well. Of course, Dustin, you know me. I am the founder and president of the Michael Pennick Jr. for Heisman Fan Club. We started in 2020. We reassemble again as we look forward to 2021. He was a part of your list on Saturday Tradition, and I think you summed it up beautifully. The biggest question for Michael Pennick Jr. will be the health, because if he is healthy, he has great command of that offense now under Nick Sheridan, and he was the Big Ten's leading passer in terms of yards per game last year through the air. If he is healthy and Indiana continues their improvement we've seen on campus in Bloomington the last couple of years, I would not be surprised to see him as a dark horse candidate.
No, absolutely not. I think he fits that into that conversation. And I think the nice thing about Michael Penix Jr. is there's not a lot of pressure on him, because you look at, obviously, the guys at Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, which we just talked about, those guys know that they're in the national spotlight. And I think that even though you're at Indiana and you've played well the last two seasons, you go 8-5 in 2019, and then you're 6-2 last season, there's not going to be a ton of eyeballs where it's a big deal every time when Michael Penix Jr. steps on the field. This is a guy who had 14 touchdown passes, only 4 interceptions. His completion percentage was low, but this is a guy who, I mean, he'll drop back and throw it down the field. He doesn't care. He knows he can trust his target, and he's got a really good one coming back in Ty Freifogel. And then you look at the running back room with Samson James and the addition now of Stephen Carr. Some really good weapons as well. And you know, the extension of the run game for for Indiana, in the fact that the past couple seasons, they have not just handed the ball off to guys like Stevie Scott and Samson James. They have those swing passes, those bubble screens. And so that's for him to pile up some of those stats. So I think from a talent standpoint, Michael Penix Jr. might be the second or third best quarterback in the Big Ten. The question is going to be, can the Heisman voters get over the fact that he's got Indiana across his chest and not an Ohio State, not a Penn State, not Michigan? Because I think that's a really big issue, whether they're willing to admit that or not. I think that's a big thing, because I think Michael Penix Jr., if he gets that completion percentage up, and if we see what he in 2021, if he's as healthy as he was in 2020, he's going to put up some big numbers. Indiana is going to be a really good football team, and he'll deserve to be in that conversation.
Yeah, when they see IU on the helmet, there is still something to be said for that. We saw that last year, not in the Heisman race, but in the bids to be a part of the New Year's Six Bowl. And that was a huge knock against Indiana because, the Big Ten's down this year. Why is Indiana up there? Because they're a good football team playing a Big Ten conference-only schedule. We don't need to go back to 2020. It gets the blood boiling at all times. But I think you're right. There is still a knock about the quarterback of Indiana as compared to Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, even Wisconsin in the West, in terms of what can they do on the national landscape. One thing I will say, though, for Michael Penix Jr. and just Indiana in general, early on in the 2021 college football season, there will be showcases in the national spotlight for that Hoosiers team to have success as a group and for individuals to stand out as well. On the road at Iowa, week number 1. They have Cincinnati in a huge non-conference game, week 3. On the road at Penn State, week number 5. And then, of course, Ohio State in week number 8 of the year. So there will be some opportunities for Indiana as a team to get some marquee wins, and also for players like Michael Pennick Jr. and Ty Freifogel and Stephen Carr to shine this upcoming year, because we talked about C.J. Stroud and all the weapons he has. Nobody is going to rival Ohio State's receiving core as a group, but I do believe that Indiana does have some weapons in the offensive game, both running the ball and passing. And I know, as we just talked about those Buckeyes, a guy that's a part of that very talented wide receiver group, possibly the best wide receiver returning to all of college football, and especially in the Big Ten Conference, is Chris Olave. He might be a guy that, if he has a monster year, could be in the Heisman race by the time we all is said and done.
Yeah, I think Chris Olave has the potential to be the best player in the Big Ten this season, the most impactful player, and a great chance to win the offensive MVP because of what he brings to the outside. I mean, that's a guy who you can hit him for a 7-yard pass, and he's going to end up, going 25, 30 yards or even longer. He's a guy who can go up. I mean, for crying out loud, this is a kid who, in the spring game, who has nothing to prove in this game. What he's capable of is going up and making big-time catches over defenders because he can. So I think his potential is there to be in the Heisman race, and I think we saw last season with Devontae Smith winning it that the Heisman voters were able to get over the fact that he was a wide receiver. Until they named him the winner, I thought for sure it was going to go to Mac Jones because it's just become such a quarterback-heavy award. So I think that works in his favor, and Pro Football Focus threw out a statistic the other day. I think he had at least one step on a defender, 85 or 90%, some ridiculous total of the plays that Ohio State ran or where he was targeted. So this is a guy who creates separation, and you're talking about him coming back another year, bigger, stronger, faster. The big question on Chris Olave and his Heisman candidacy is, as we've talked about now, is he going to get the touches? Because Garrett Wilson is really good. Julian Fleming is really good. Jackson Smith-Njigba is really good. So there are a lot of different options that C.J. Stroud is going to have in that offense. So that's why I don't think he's going to necessarily be the favorite out of the Big Ten, but I think he's one of those top 5 guys where if he's the number 1 target and C.J. Stroud hits him regularly, he's got the potential to put up some big numbers. And you look at last season, and this is the reason why I'm not ready to put him in like a top 2 categories, because he and Garrett Wilson had about the same total last season. Olave had 729 receiving yards, and Wilson had 723, and I think the difference was 1 touchdown. So just crazy numbers, but he's a player I think is going to be one of the top receivers in the 2022 NFL draft, one of the best players in college football next season. And so I think he will definitely be part of that conversation. It's just a matter to me of, will he have the numbers to back up his candidacy for that trophy?
It's almost a double-edged sword, right? Because he has so many other talented wide receivers around him on that field for Ohio State that you can't square in on him necessarily as a defense, or you are left exposed by Garrett Wilson or Jackson Smith-Njigba or any of the other talented offensive weapons Ohio State has. But because they have such a plethora of weapons, maybe he's not going to be a guy that's targeted 15 to 17 times a game like you would see with a classic number 1 wide receiver. I also will say, I think the reason Devontae Smith was included in there, Devontae Smith, the first wide receiver to win the Heisman Trophy this past season in almost 30 years, when a guy out of the Big Ten, of course, Desmond Howard from Michigan, won it, was they also presented something in the return game. And I don't really remember Chris Olave as a part of the return game. He might be featured on punt return, but maybe this year coming up, maybe they allow him to do that because he is such an athlete and such a weapon and could put up numbers there. But if he doesn't have a substantial part of the return game, maybe some of those total yards, that might be a knock against him. One final guy I think we should get to from the Big Ten Conference as it pertains to possibly making a Heisman candidacy in the 2021 college football season. Like I mentioned, 17 out of the 21 Heisman Trophy winners, years 2000 up until present day, have been quarterbacks. The 4 others, 1 wide receiver in Devontae Smith, 3 running backs. So there is a small precedent, especially in the 2010s, for a running back who has a monster year to be in consideration for the Heisman Trophy. And I think the focus then becomes the 2020 Big Ten running back of the year, Mohamed Ibrahim, who put up monster numbers in only 7 games for the Golden Gophers last season.
Yeah, you're talking about a guy who ran for 1,036 yards, 15 touchdowns. That's a ridiculous number.
7 games, Dustin. In 7 That's a great 17-game NFL season, and he did it in 7. It's ridiculous.
And what we're not talking about, and I don't know if people quite understand this outside of the state of Minnesota, they did not have Daniel Fa'alele or Curtis Dunlap Jr., two of their starting offensive linemen from the season ago, two of the three best offensive linemen, I would argue, at Minnesota. So he's doing that basically as a one-man wrecking crew.
Yep.
The big question to me is, and you have those guys back, I mean, they're going to pave the way. There might not be a defender within 30 yards of him on some plays. Like, that's how much of a difference I think that's going to make. The one question I have when it comes to Mohamed Ibrahim is, again, it's similar to the Chris Olave concerns. I really liked what I saw from Minnesota in that spring game with their passing attack. I thought Tanner Morgan, the ball was zipping out of his hand. He was hitting his targets. Chris Ottman-Bell looks like he's ready to replace Rashad Bateman without much of an issue. They got some really good receivers there. PJ Fleck has done an excellent job at developing that position. So I don't know if he's going to get the same number of touches that he got last season because of the fact that they should have a better passing attack this season, especially when you talk about the offensive line. I mean, it wasn't bad a year ago, but it wasn't nearly what it was in 2019. I expect that passing attack will look like it did in 2019. So what does that mean for Ibrahim and his touches? He's good enough to be a Heisman Trophy candidate, but I've also said that about Jonathan Taylor, who rushed for 2,000 yards nearly 3 times and didn't get one single invite to New York City, but that's a different conversation for a different day.
Right.
So talented enough. I don't know if he's on JT's level, but he's certainly in that conversation where if he has a big season and Minnesota goes 10-2 again, he absolutely belongs in that discussion because he's going to be a huge part of that offense. And this is a guy who, when he gets in the red zone, he's almost a guaranteed touchdown. So he could see big touchdown numbers this season because he's so big. He's going to be running behind a strong offensive line, and he's just so powerful that he's almost impossible to bring down.
It's kind of like the same conversation around Chris Olave. If the offense is better for Minnesota, it might mean a little bit less production out of Mohamed Ibrahim himself individually, but it also could be, if the offense is better and they're scoring more points, maybe more opportunities for Mo Ibrahim to take advantage. You talk about that offensive line. Having Daniel Fa'alele back, who is 6'9", 400 pounds, is going to be huge. A second year under Mike Sanford Jr. for all of that offense to be accommodated to, I think is also going to help Minnesota this upcoming year. My biggest hesitation about the Golden Gophers is the other side of the ball on defense, to see how successful they will be as a team this year. Dustin, absolutely incredible stuff as we look at some of the Heisman